Okay, it's quarter of. We'll go ahead and get started. This is one of my favorite time slots because this is about the time of day where it starts to set in that you all stayed out way too late last night. And you've been well fed. So if your neighbors beside you start snoring, just nudge them a little bit. My name is Ed Hild. I'm a technology architect at the Microsoft Technology Center in Reston, Virginia, which is just outside Washington, D.C. To give you a little bit idea of my background, what I do is meet with Microsoft's enterprise customers and work with them through a lot of their challenges. So those sessions can be anything from strategy briefings, which are all around educating them on what the product capabilities are, mapping them to their organization's challenges, those type of things, to architecture design sessions where I spend 2 days with maybe an IT group that's focused on rolling out a technology, and we whiteboard for those 2 days, drawing what does the architecture going to look like, capacity planning exercises, answering their questions around security, governance, all those types of things. And then I also do proof of concepts in the data center that we have. And if you're not familiar with the MTC org, we're a worldwide organization, so there are MTCs all throughout the U.S. and overseas as well. And it's a resource that you as a customer or a partner can leverage inside of Microsoft. So take time to look us up. It's just Microsoft.com/MTC. And again, I'm the SharePoint architect on that team. You might also know me. I'm an author. I've written 2 books, both from A Press. These books are kind of the classic deep developer examples, if you will, and a lot of office business application type development where I do open XML, document assemblies, all that other kind of stuff. All SharePoint driven, but working in the desktop client stuff as well. There will not nearly be as much code in this talk as there is in those books. Right? So some of you might have seen me speak before. Generally, I almost disregard the PowerPoint entirely and just start working on the demos. Since it's in the architecture track, we'll divvy up our time a bit. We'll spend a good bit of time with slides talking about some of the issues around site provisioning and why you should be concerned, best practices, and when to make what decision. And then there will be some demos at the end that do involve a little bit of Visual Studio and a little bit of code. So hopefully that doesn't scare anybody that I'm going to launch Visual Studio. Yes? Okay. And if you hang around for the end, I promise you a demo that you will love. So I, with only a few lines of code, provision a site collection, assign it to a particular content database, give it a quota template, make it so that the URLs in a particular managed path with a particular convention, activate features like turning on auditing by default, address issues around templates and all of those things in one nice demo at the end. Right? That pretty much wraps up all the questions I typically get asked around this particular topic. So what does our agenda look like? Now we're going to start a little basic just to level set the room. So we're going to do a little bit of vocabulary, which hopefully is review for most of you that are here. And then we'll dive into why it's important, and we'll work over to those demonstrations. Now, I'm not a designer, so you're going to have to ignore some of the graphic skills demonstrated on these PowerPoint slides. So the real quick question is, and I've seen this tons of times, hopefully you as architects have as well. A customer comes in, says they're really excited about SharePoint. They've already built out a pilot site. This might be an example of an extranet, where someone types in the URL, they go to a root site that all customers see. From there, they can click on what customer they are, customer A, B, or C, and then underneath that are different project sites. So the main question on this slide is, how many site collections is that? You can use your hands and be able to show how many there are. Thank you very much, sir in the back. That is one site collection, right? Because the way I described it, there was a single root, which was that customer site, and they were using the out-of-the-box navigation for everything else that is below it. Anybody seen this in customer scenarios? A SharePoint deployment that's exactly one site collection? Okay, so I'm not alone. Why is that a little bit concerning? Well, so what about some facts around site collections, if you will? It is the most important structure in a SharePoint deployment that you have control of as an administrator. So you shouldn't just let end users drive what your topology should be. Your ability to manage the environment, to be able to enforce governance policies and controls that you care about, are this decision of site versus site collection is absolutely paramount. So some facts about site collections. They can be provisioned at a managed path. For those of you who don't know what managed paths are, you get exactly one in the out-of-the-box deployment. That's /sites. Right? So when you go into central admin, create site collections, you can choose /sites and give any wildcard URL that you want there. Managed paths are those hang-off points. What people don't necessarily always know is that you can create more managed paths. They're a really good categorization mechanism. If you have team sites that represent projects versus team sites that represent customers, or team sites that represent different things, they all look like team sites, but you can group them together with managed paths. They're also the place within the product that you as an administrator get to assign quotas. Quotas are a must. They are, even if you're willing, let's say, to up the quota every time somebody asks you or hit their limit, you should still be setting quotas. Now, quotas get a little bit of a bad rap because people have flashbacks to really small quotas on Exchange mailboxes, right? But quotas in SharePoint are a trigger mechanism for you so that you're aware when something has grown beyond the size that you initially anticipated when you gave out that site, right? It defines an inheritance tree for security. What does this mean? If I set permissions at the root, they cascade down, right? Just like they do on a file share. Permissions at the site level go down to each individual subsite. Within those subsites, they cascade down to libraries and lists, with individual folders within those document libraries, and even the items themselves. This actually is a pro of a site collection. Why do I pause there? Because a lot of customers I see this as a con. Because there'll be one tier in their site collection where they're constantly breaking security inheritance and setting individual permissions. That's a telltale yellow flag sign of maybe that work shouldn't be done in that site collection. It supports out-of-the-box navigation. This is how we get into this trouble to begin with, right? Because SharePoint builds that lovely navigation for you from the root all the way down. You can see all the subsites within, when you click on those, you can see all the libraries. But navigation really is a logical thing on top of your site collection topology. Right? Now, there's not too much support of it out of the box, but navigation is something you can blur the lines with later. Let me give you an example of that. To end users, they think they're My Sites underneath the portal homepage. Right? But the My Sites are probably maybe in a whole separate web application in their own individual site collection. So you can blur that illusion. I'll show you later with a technique on how to do it. The rule you care about mostly in terms of scale is content must reside within a content database. That means that a site collection's content, so all the libraries in this structure I have on the right, has to be contained within a single content database. I cannot split them. I cannot partition them. I can still have many site collections in the same content database. I don't break that rule, but I can't take a site collection and spread it across more than one content database. If you're working with customers today and you're in a consulting-based role, one of the first questions to ask your customers, how many content databases do you have? What's the usual answer that you get? One, because that's how many they got when they clicked next, 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 and did the install, right? We'll talk about why that's not necessarily a good thing later. And last but not least is one of my favorite features that also doesn't get a lot of press, and that's this feature called Site Use Confirmation and Deletion. This is a setting at the web application level that you can use to make sure that your SharePoint environment doesn't end up looking like your file shares today, with a bunch of old, stale content that nobody cares about. Right? So the idea behind site use confirmation and deletion is very powerful in ad hoc collaboration scenarios, where someone says, hey, I need a team site for a meeting next week. If I spin that up in an area where this is turned on, I can not only give them the site collection, I can say 90 days or a year from now, whatever time frame I want, I'm going to come back and ask you, do you still need it? If you ignore me or you say no, I can automatically archive and delete it. Right? So cleanup, if you will. Most of this review, yes? Good. So with that diagram I had before, what are some of the questions you should start asking yourself as an admin as to whether or not you hand out a site collection to somebody or you just simply create a sub-site somewhere else? At what level will quotas be maintained is a great question. So in the earlier example, remember I had a bunch of customers and underneath each customer I had different projects. If I told you that each project had to have its own quota, would projects have to be sites or site collections? Site collections. Right? Are there different service level agreements for different customers? Do you have people that you charge more to, right, in order to work with them to host these sites? If so, you probably want to be backing up and recovering their content more frequently or have different uptime, recovery time objectives than you do for others. So now that hits back to that content database strategy. If I have exactly one content database, I have exactly one backup and recovery strategy. Right? That database has all that stuff in it. I can't single out different sites to have different service level agreements. Right? Inside your SharePoint environment, if your intranet homepage goes down and all the My Sites goes down, which one are you going to work on first getting up? Probably the homepage that every user has. The My Sites can wait a little bit later. Well, you need to make sure that that content's separate from a database standpoint. Do we need to distribute content across databases? Just as a simple scale question. Do I have to prevent accidental access across customers or projects? This one's my favorite because it's also a little known feature. There's only really one place inside of SharePoint that there's an override security ACL. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if this was a requirement that I wanted to make sure, let's say I have a sales rep that's managing 2 customers. And accidentally they go into customer A, but they assign read rights to an identity that's really from customer B. They screwed up, they typed the wrong John or spelt the name wrong and chose the wrong user. Right? What prevents that from happening? Well, there are policies, security policies at the web application layer where you can write overarching grant or denies. So you see this done a lot in organizations that kind of have firewalls built within them, like regulated and unregulated industries, where you can't mix and match that content. Or a military example would be, let's see, a coalition networks, right, where you might have a set of sites that are focused for, say, England and the US and Australia to be able to share content, but not a combination of just England and Australia. So these type of deny policies you can assign at the web application level, and it will actually override any specific security ACL that's set within the system. There's one security account that uses this feature in a default installation, and that's the search service. That policy's there to make sure that search can always index and read all the content you put in the site. But you can extend and add your own security settings there. Will the customer sites require their own developed web parts? Do we have any need for process isolation, making sure that custom components deployed for one don't impact another? What will the naming conventions be for URLs? Certainly a key question to ask. And that's so I haven't given you any answers yet. I'm just trying to lay out the problem. Agree? All right. I'm big on nonverbal feedback, and I love applause. So if you see a really cool demo later, make sure you applaud. So what are your out-of-the-box provisioning controls? What does the product give you? Not a lot. Right? If we're talking about site collections, you can go, of course, as an administrator, create them in central administration. But most of my talk is focused not on admin users doing things, but on end users being able to do things themselves, but without giving them the keys to the kingdom. Right? A much more controlled space where we allow them to self-enable and then self-empower certain features, but we do it within the confines and policies that we've set forth. So with site collections, your only option in the product is to go in and turn on self-service site creation. And if you turn that on, you turn it on in central administration for a web app. That will allow users to create site collections at managed paths, and they get to specify everything. They get to pick the title of the site collection. They get to pick the template. They get to specify what they want the URL to be. All of these choices. Right? That might be very appropriate in an ad hoc collaboration space, but there's a lot of types of provisioning processes where you want to give users site collections, but you don't want to give them that much choice. If you're creating site collections for a particular business process, for example, you may already have built a template that you want to force them to use. I'll show you that a little bit later. For just sites, here we're talking about subsites or webs within a site collection. That's just a simple permission given, usually at that top level site. And again, they're now limited that the site they're creating is within that space, but they're still picking everything, right? What the title is, what the URL is, what the template is. The goal of this talk, if there's no goal other than me talking, is to show you how to take what's there and take the policies that you really want users to follow from a governance standpoint and enforce them within the product. Right? Automate those steps, get administrators out of it so not everything is a help desk ticket. So we'll do a quick demo here of just the out-of-the-box self-service site provisioning so you get an idea of what that experience looks like with no help, and then the 2 demos later will fill in those gaps. Let's wake up my demo machine here. So this is SharePoint local. I have a couple demos that are Office 365 based as well, so I'll try to always make it clear where I'm working. This is my local machine here, and this is central administration. So self-service site provisioning, right? So if I go in to application management, manage my web application, on any particular web app, there's that option for self-service site creation. Now it says site creation, it really means site collection creation. Right? The product's not always really clear when it uses the word site, whether it's one versus the other. So if I click here, you gotta love a setting that is simply a radio button of on or off. Even better, you gotta read the fine print, because as an administrator, you just click on. Well, let me zoom in here. You click on and you think you're done, right? Read the fine print. The fine print says that when you turn this on, an announcement will be added to the announcements list on the home page of the top level site. The announcement will provide a link to the site creation page. Guess what? If that root top level site is a team site, there isn't an announcements list. You'll be hard pressed to guess that link. So do make sure you put the announcements list in before you turn this setting on. What does that look like to your end users? Well, here's that web application, here's that root site, and sure enough, I created the announcements list. There's that link for self-service site creation. This is their only clue. So they click this announcement, and it says it's been enabled. If you want a new site collection, go ahead and click here. This is the screen that hopefully you've seen a million times, right? Do realize that here I'm not creating sub-sites, I'm creating site collections. And here's what I meant by the users have a lot of choice. They can go in and specify their own title, so title here, their own description, or leave it blank even. Maybe it's not required, right? They get to choose what managed path they have, they select. Now I've created a few here just to give you an idea of project sites. They're going to be in our demo later about a business process I have around projects for this company, where I want those site collections to go. Classes, I've done another demo for an education organization, so every class had its own site collection. Customers might be a different one if we're focusing on an extranet maybe. But the problem here though is that there's no validation of the user choice. If they select project sites but then later on down in here choose a template of a classroom, the product will let them do that. Everybody understand the problem? Yes, okay, great. And they get to choose their own template. Just to highlight a little bit later, see this project sites template? That's a custom one that I'll show you how that was built at the very last demo. We don't actually need to create one. I'm pretty sure you're confident in that. So let's go back to the PowerPoint for a bit. PowerPoint button. So why is all of this stuff important? Well, I'm here to tell you that the customers that I've worked with, a best practice is if you're in the IT organization, don't send out an announcement to your end users saying, we deployed SharePoint. Use it. Please. And then expect them to know what to do with it. Right? In fact, I would argue that the actual name of the technology should be kind of left out. What you want to do, because likely, the rollout 100% of this product, it's massive. And if nothing else, out of this sessions you've been sitting through in this conference, there's endless and endless and endless features that'll just completely overwhelm any end user. So my advice if you're a customer, or my advice if you're a consultant on how to talk to customers, is get organizations thinking about rolling out services. Now my use of the term services warrants a bit of explanation, because most people think I mean the shared services that are within the product. I don't mean that. I mean as a service that provides some value to the end user. What's in it for them? right? So enterprise search is an example of one such service. You could send out that IT announcement saying, we rolled out enterprise search. Now you'll be able to find all your junk that you've stored in file shares. And if you happen to find anything that you don't think you should have read rights to, let us know. Right? We're crawling your file shares, we're crawling our customer database, we're crawling all of this, and there's a one-stop shop you can go to find information within our enterprise. Right? Everybody chuckled. Why could they possibly find something in the file share that they think should be hidden? Because the security hackles in the file share aren't really set up right. Right? SharePoint does security trimming on search. Every time somebody crawls their file shares, though, they're convinced that feature's not working. So start to communicate SharePoint as services to end users. An ad hoc team collaboration service is another good one. Right? These are things that a lot of organizations, users don't have those today. An enterprise search or an ad hoc collaboration service where they can go fill out a form and get a site for themselves. Right? Most time in organizations, they roll out SharePoint, and what are they focused on first? The home page of the internet. Because it's the thing that everybody sees. It's also one of the things that takes the longest for you to roll out. Right? You care a lot more about taxonomy, do a lot more around branding. There's lots of people involved because there's a lot of big decisions that are being made. Rolling out enterprise search, low-hanging fruit. Rolling out ad hoc collaboration, telling users they don't need to send attachments in emails and have the horrors of sending attachments back and forth to each other everywhere, low-hanging fruit. Right? And as you start to describe these as services, why are we taking time here? Because the site collection topologies in these services will be different. Because the content is different and the intent of how the users are going to use those sites are different. So department level publishing sites, this is not an exhaustive list, but personal sites and social networking ones, these are just very common ones that I see. It enables you to do a phased rollout, and it also enables you to write different governance policy documentation around each of those services. When people hear the term governance a lot, they think they got to go out and create this one massive 100-page document that talks about all the customizations that users are allowed to do and what features they're allowed to use on all the sites. 100-page document, your end users will never read it. Target it at a specific type of service and get that down to about 10 pages, they might read it. Right? So your goal of one governance document it shouldn't be the goal. It should be many little governance documents. Because what you enable users to do on their My sites are going to be different than what they can do on ad hoc team sites. It's going to be different than what they can do on the home page of the internet. It's going to be different than what they can do in a departmental level publishing or collaboration site. So break those up. Don't just write one. And that way they don't have to read 100% of the documentation in order to do the action that they're trying to do in that immediate moment. Make sense? All right. So this is usually a whiteboard for me. It doesn't translate to PowerPoint really well. So a little bit of disbelief with the drawing, okay? In fact, I've been drawing this diagram for so long, because I even drew the same diagram with SharePoint Server 2003, that the diagram has a name. Right? And that name is the spectrum of intent. So what this is going to do is start to communicate to you how you should start looking at site structures different based on the type of service that we were mentioning earlier. So if this is the spectrum of intent, intent being what are the users plan to do with the site once you give it to them. On one end of the spectrum, we have publishing sites. Now again, don't go too SharePoint native on me and think publishing sites as in publishing sites with the feature of publishing turned on. I mean sites whose intent is to distribute content. How can you tell a site focused on distributing content? Many readers, very few authors. The authors that are there are just gatekeepers for the content. That content's getting created somewhere else, but it's getting distributed on a publishing site. On the other end of the spectrum, my sites, right? Those personal dashboards, my little personal shared documents repository, and those type of things. In the middle is the world of collaboration. This is where people are creating content, coming together, and have working documents. So what does this mean from a site collection standpoint? Well, publishing sites, home pages of intranets, even a departmental level site that's focused on distributing content, right, tends to have a deep site collection structure to it. because you're taking the time to organize all that content that you have. If it's the homepage of an intranet, the very first thing I do with that site collection is put it in a content database and make sure that no other site collections go into that database, because it's probably going to have the highest SLA of anything else that you roll out. My sites, anybody know my sites? So Bob, Jane, Joe, Jerry, they all got my sites, right? Are they all one site collection? No, right? They're not, because they can all have different quotas. And since you know that's a feature of site collections, they have to be peers of each other. So my sites look a lot like that, very flat, right? They're flat. Publishing sites, distributed sites, are more of a scale-up mentality. Because I'm limited on that one database, the more and more content I get, I'm more interested in scaling up because they can't scale out. The my sites on the other end, since I'm going to have a lot of them, and they're going to kind of come and go, right? Because my sites get created, those site collections, the very first time the user clicks that my site link. It's end user provisioned, right? Therefore, it's going to be more of a scale out model. We're going to come up with a particular quota and kind of, stripe them, if you will, across a bunch of content databases. It's really important that your my site site collections don't end up in the content database of your homepage of your intranet. Okay? Yes? All right. People are nodding. That's good. Now, believe it or not, most of the things I've talked about so far, you've probably seen in TechNet documentation, MSDN documentation, and so forth. This is where I tend to differ a little bit. It's a little bit of a practical experience in that I divide the world of collaboration into two buckets, not just one. And that's because when I've worked with customers, I've noticed that there really seems to be two different types of collaboration, and you can distinguish them based on the lifetime. There is collaboration that is forever. It's a department. It's always going to be a department in that organization. Even if we change the name later, there's no end in sight, right? As opposed to there's these group of 5 people that need to plan this committee event or this meeting that's next week, right? So the world of ad hoc collaboration versus department or organizational kind of collaboration. Now, collaboration sites in the left-hand side of this, since they tend to be more important to the organization, tend to have a lot more content in them, and tend to have a bit of a site collection topology to them. Right? Now, I'm showing these each having their own database. That's just a choice for this diagram. It's not necessarily the case. You could have different departments that have different levels of adoption, and maybe a few of them share, and those people that are those early adopters that ramp on board first, they get their own database because they're storing tons of content in it. The good news about this is that you can identify the content that's in this section, I lost my mouse there, as opposed to the publishing sites, because the site permissions are really different here. In a collaboration world for a department, this is going to be all the content that they're working on. So it wouldn't be surprising to see everyone in the IT department has contribute rights to the IT department's collaboration site collection. Now, the content that they publish doesn't get published here. It gets published over there in a publishing site collection. Right? So there might be a working group that's coming together to update all the security policy content. While they're working on it, it's here. But then don't try to break security inheritance and make everyone be able to read it somewhere within this structure. It moves to the publishing sites. And similarly, on the right-hand side of this, the ad hoc world tends to be very flat, much like the my sites. And why are they flat? Because there's a lot more volatility there. It's definitely something where you're going to get a lot of site collections, so you need a scale-out model. And it tends to have more things in common with my sites than the publishing sites. What's beautiful about this diagram is right now that line that goes down the middle. Can you see the dotted line down the middle of the screen? That line, by the way, is everything to the left-hand side of that line is usually provisioned by IT. Everything that's to the right-hand side of that line is usually provisioned by the end user themselves. Right? Some type of self-service. So what does that mean from a web application standpoint? Because that's the piece I left out. As it turns out, content databases aren't owned really by site collections. They're owned by web applications. So when you create a new site collection, it's going to go in a content database owned by the web application you put that site collection within. So if your white paper, back of the napkin architecture, almost a default starting point, if you will, for any organization rolling out this stuff, you should kind of at least have three web applications. One for the My Sites, one for the ad hoc collaboration, and then one that you could put these publishing sites in inside, in the same web app as the collaboration department stuff. How can you get away with doing that just in one web application? I said everything on the left was IT provisioned. They're taking a lot more time to figure out what's in what database as they set those up, right? So you could have split this out even more, but you need at least three. One that contains your intranet, one that contains your team ad hoc collaboration, and one that contains your My Sites. Like the diagram? Right? So remember, you heard it here, spectrum of intent. Yes? No? All right, no Twitter feeds about the bad name of the diagram. All right. So let's shift this. We've been talking a little bit about governance around the site provisions and really why do you care. Governance to me is all about prescriptive policies, procedures, guidance that you're giving, what types of customizations, how you're communicating, the expectations around service level agreements and performance and all of those things. And really, it comes down to people like to write a bunch of stuff in those policy documents, but very rarely do they put the product in such a configuration that it does it for the users automatically. Right? I kind of equate it to every organization probably has some policy that says you should only keep email for this amount of time. But we know you don't delete all your email. Right? Because unless you're using the latest versions of Exchange, you're not automating that process of getting rid of those things. So you have that policy, but you're not enforcing it. And what we really care about in the SharePoint world is we want to make sure these policies that we put in place about where stuff should go is enforced because we're planning our expectation against it, how we're backing up and recovering it, right? How we're scaling it up or scaling it out. So if we've done all that work on the back end, we want to make sure that the stuff gets in the right spot when the end user performs the action. So I have two demos. This one here will just have a voice introduction, and then we have a few slides to set up the next one. This one here is an Office 365 demonstration. So let's switch over to the laptop. And we can kill some screens here. Now, I find the easiest way to show you these demonstrations is to show you the end user experience first, and then to show you the behind the scenes what was done. Right? Now, just so you keeping me honest, right? Look, edhill.sharepoint.com. SharePoint.com, Office 365, SharePoint Online tenant. Why do I build one in Office 365? Well, it also helps show off that the same techniques and things that I'm describing for an on-prem instance for an enterprise also apply in the SharePoint Online cloud space. Right? So the idea behind this is that we have a single site collection here. And we have a bunch of different proposals, if you will, for new product ideas. And the one we're going to work with in particular is this one called the Follow Me microblogging service. And if I just view the properties of this document, you'll see that it has a bunch of metadata associated with it. Things like who's the contributor, the product description, the product name, and so forth. Why is that important? Because when I fill out this form, I had better not make that user retype everything in. So InfoPath forms, still available in SharePoint Online, and I can support the data connections back. So this automatically populated with the content that is in that document library, and when I choose one, it fills out most of that form for me. Right? Everybody realizes there's no code here to this, right? I'm just showing off InfoPath forms and data connections. Well, I'll go ahead and click Submit to trigger this request, because really this is a request that if it's approved and this company decides that it's a product idea should move forward, we're going to spin up a new subsite within this structure, invite all the users and do all those types of things. So there's a workflow that is started automatically, and we can see that going down here to the workflow for this form. So it's in progress. Here's the nice Visio visualization of my SharePoint Designer workflow. Right? It's not a Visual Studio workflow. Visual Studio workflows are fully trusted, can't run in SharePoint Online. So it's just SharePoint Designer you can use here. If I scroll down, there's a task. We'll pretend to be Perry here and edit the task. I love this feature because most people don't know you can do it. SharePoint Designer, right, as you use it to create tasks, generates a form behind the scenes. You can use InfoPath and customize the forms that it's automatically generating. So I've gone into this form, added a few fields that you see at the bottom, and even added my own branding. You don't have to be stuck with just the out-of-the-box forms, even when you're only using SharePoint Designer and not Visual Studio. So I'll show you that too as we go behind the scenes. So let's go ahead and approve it. Wait patiently, or not so patiently. All right, well, we can reorder the demo while we wait for the workflow task. See, the minute I move on is when it goes. So over here, notice that it's running inside this box here called Custom Action. That is my customization that I'll show you in a bit that's starting the site creation process, which is written down here in the history list. Everybody can see the history list? All right. So if we go back to the root, and again, this site that is the root site here is using a publishing template. So it has the fancy master pages and styles and everything that's going on within it. It turns out that the site that I'm creating, the Follow Me site in this case, is just using the STS#0 team site template. I'm going to use this to kind of hit home a few other ideas as well. So when I click on the site, sure enough, it did generate the site for me. But as an end user, I'm a little underwhelmed. Why am I underwhelmed? I'm inside the same site collection. My global nav went away. Right? What about all the branding? That was disappointing. Why did the branding go away? I thought master pages cascade all the way through. Right? Well, the reason in this case it did is because publishing pages and publishing sites and just team sites have different settings and different configurations in terms of master pages. So it didn't inherit, even though the site collection is set up to inherit. Right? So I'm going to do a couple things to clean that up and fix it. Now, even though I'm just fixing branding in this case, the governance tool, if you will, is much larger. How can you, after a site has been created inside of a site collection, go through and manually set some settings as opposed to instructing your end user or some administrator to do it? I'm just picking on the master pages, but the concept is much larger than that. Right. So let's delete this site and run that workflow again, hopefully faster this time. This is where you hope and pray that I'm not deleting the root site. There's no site recycle bin yet there. So we go back here. We got to do a little bit of cleanup. So let's get rid of this list item that it created to help me out without having to guess what the URL is. So we should be good to go. I won't fill out the form again. I'll just start it. Now, most people see this screen here and say, yeah, Ed told us he wasn't a graphic designer. The workflow normally starts automatically, right? Usually users don't see this screen. So we'll go ahead and click Start. We'll run the workflow again. We will approve it. But before I approve it, I'll go on and turn on one customization. So at the site collection level here, I have a feature that's called the Southridge Workflow Actions Site Provision Receiver. Everybody see Site Provision Receiver? This is new to SharePoint 2010, and it gives you the ability to run code in response to a web getting created inside of the site. So we'll see what the end result of that is, and then we'll look at that code. So if I go back to here and finish off that task, not the form, the task. So it's still in progress. Pull up the really pretty form. Go ahead and approve it again. So I was going to take a drink while it waited. Go back to the root. It does take a second to show up here. So we do have the Follow Me site. If I go down and click on the link, ta-da. Thank you. So it worked. Yay. How did it work? right? So the behind the scenes of this is a bit interesting. So there is a customization here, two of them in fact, right? One of them is that enabled me to create the site itself, and the other one that did the cleanup after the site got created. So how did I get to be able to create a site? Well, I told you before it was a workflow, and it was a SharePoint Designer workflow, right? So if I go in and edit it, I'm not going to build it in front of you, but you see I do a bunch of stuff of grabbing some variables. I run an approval process, which we'll come back to in a second. This is the step that just creates the site. All the stuff you care about a lot happens down here. Notice this one action. Then create a site titled based on the requested name, described as this, at this URL, with this template in the locale 1033, which is English, right? And any exception that happens, write it to this variable so I can do the terrible developer thing and write it in the history list, right? This is a SharePoint Designer workflow. That's an action, but that is not an action you would see in your environment. It's a fully fledged one here, though, right? If I go up to Actions, it shows up in Southridge Actions category. Remember, this is running an Office 365 and SharePoint Online. So as it turns out, you can build custom workflow actions that integrate directly into SharePoint Designer, and you can build them as a sandbox solution. Cool, yes? So before we jump to that sandbox solution, if I drill into the approval process, just to highlight a few things here, people always ask me, how did I get the custom fields on the task form? Inside of SharePoint Designer, there's a whole section here called Task Form Fields. This is where you go and you add what those fields are. Now, I also auto-populated those fields with values, right, from the form that was submitted. All you have to do is go into, change the behavior of a task, and you get this little event, if you will, of right before a task is assigned, I can do some actions here that are setting up the fields that are on that task form. So that's how you can add your own custom stuff into the forms that SharePoint Designer is building for you automatically. How did I get the brand? If I go back, I clicked one step too far. Once you publish this once, you'll get the two info path forms that are generated at the bottom here. The one that's marked approval represents the task that I told SharePoint SharePoint Designer I wanted it to create when I was trying to collect the user information. If you click on that form here inside the Designer, it'll pull it all the way into InfoPath for you, show you the schema, including the custom fields that you added. And now here, you can add that branding, drag and drop things, change labels for things, and customize this form so it has more appeal than just the out-of-the-box generated one. So you're getting a little bonus material here, right? SharePoint Designer 101, probably 201 for workflows. You just quick publish that back up. So I said there was a little bit of code. Let's look at the Visual Studio piece here. There are two features, if you will, because I wanted to be able to do the demo with the cleanup turned off and the cleanup turned on. The most interesting piece that's here is the actual creation. So all this is a method that returns a hash table. This is the code that gives me the workflow action capability. So it takes in all of those parameters that you would expect, the site title, the description, the URL, and so forth. And all it does is goes in, creates the new site collection, allwebs.add, right? Like 6 lines of code there, if you scratch out the error handling. Now, unfortunately, it's a lot of XML. So all the XML here is one of those things you steal from my blog and then paste it into your own project. All of this markup is here is because SharePoint Designer reads this file in order to generate the rendering inside of the tool. So notice here's that statement. Create a site titled this, described as that, at this URL. That's the template, if you will, for how that action renders in the SharePoint Designer workflow tool. Now, this is a sandbox version of these. It turns out if you build workflow actions that are fully trusted, the format of the project is completely different. You start talking about a .actions file as opposed to doing this markup in an elements file. So just be careful when you're reading building custom workflow actions, whether you're talking about fully farm trusted on-prem code or sandbox solution ones. The site provision receiver here. So notice this runs web provisioned. Just like most of your eventing, there's before and after eventing to a site getting created. This one here just runs this method that does a little bit of comparing and contrasting, figuring out if there is a custom master URL setting, which is specific to publishing sites. And if it is, making sure that value is set to the master page setting on the team site that I create. And this little last one line of code here that says navigation.useShared, that tells it that the parent navigation should cascade down. So the global nav is always consistent. Right? Again, I don't want to turn it into a developer session where we explain every line of code, but those are some of the key things. You can use this same technique to turn on any types of features that you want on or off or activated or deactivated as sites get created within a site collection. Did you like the demonstration? All right, the next one's cooler. We have to do a little bit of setup. That's a summary. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that there's a little bit of a cheat here, right? And that little bit of a cheat is that I can't do anything about changing the security context of the user in SharePoint Online. Sandbox solutions don't enable me to kind of drop down and run as the Surface account or run with elevated privileges or any of those types of things. So my user could have gone into the Site Actions menu and chose New Site, because I wasn't hiding it, and skip my process entirely. Right? So when you're running in that Office 365 world, you need to take those into consideration and make sure that some of those alternate paths, are not available. My second scenario requires some explaining. So let's pretend we're in an organization where there is a defined business process for rolling out project sites. Right? Now that project sites, we take a look at it, we go through the requirements, and we decide sites aren't really enough. We really want site collections because we want separate quotas. We want different site collection administrators to get notified. We want different usage confirmation, deletion turned on. We want to treat it more like that ad hoc collaboration than we do publishing sites. So this demo here is going to be focused on creating site collections, which immediately means, by the way, it has to run on-prem. You can't automate that in Office 365. What are some of the things that we want to do? What are some of the key governance settings, the little switches that you will, if we want to turn on? Now, I picked the set that I commonly get asked. You may have others. You can fit almost anything you want to do into this structure. Basically, what I really want is a site very similar to the default STS site for these project site collections. However, I really want auditing turned on by default. Right? This is a setting that normally after you give the site, the administrator goes into site collection settings and turns on all the auditing sections. So you get more verbose auditing within the product. I'd also like the breadcrumb navigation to lead back to the project's intranet site. So what I'm going to have here is a publishing site where people can request new project sites, but I'm creating site collections off to the side that are peers. I want the breadcrumb navigation to be able to get them back to a certain spot that I specify in that main publishing intranet site. This is what I made the statement earlier, that navigation's logical on top of site collection structures. This is my little hint, if you will, about how to be able to get your users that illusion that these things are really underneath each other when they're not. I want to use a specific managed path, so all these sites are going to be /project sites. I want the URL not to be determined by the user. I want a convention. So whatever the project number is, we're going to assign a unique number. That's what the URL is going to look like. So project site /2, for example. I want a default quota to be set. I have already defined a quota template. That quota template I think is 500 meg, but I want that quota to be assigned when they get created, much like my sites do automatically. And I want to choose a content database. Because I know with these projects I have a particular backup and recovery procedure, I want to make sure that these site collections for now all go in this specific content database. Sound like a worthy challenge? Thank you. I love this crowd. Thank you. Before I show you the demo, there's one aside. Well, I said template. That begs some explanation, right? There are tons of different ways you can build templates within the product. All of them have different pros and cons. Right? So site templates. How many of you have ever created a site template? Right? It's the most easiest end user thing to do. You go in, you mock up the site how you want, and then you take a picture of it at that moment in time. That picture is when you go save site as template. Why do I say it's a picture? Because now everything that you build only applies what that picture you took. Right? If you decide that you'd like to change something, and that all the sites you'd like to create from now on need to have like 5 other things, you got to take another picture. You got to go in, create an instance of those, add those 5 things, take another picture, and now use that one. Right? Site templates are good in that it's really easy for them to include content, but the minute you start doing that, you run against possible upload limits in terms of their size. Right? You put tons of content in them, all of a sudden you can't upload them to the gallery because it's subject to the same throttling that document libraries have. Right? Also, not the easiest thing in the world to migrate. Would you agree? Okay. So for those reasons, a lot of times, and by the way, these are lessons learned over many, many years of working with SharePoint for me. I was a site definition junkie when SharePoint 2003 came out. I loved going in, building onet.xml files in Notepad. Sick individual, yes? Right? And doing all of that stuff and getting exactly what I wanted. Infinite control. A very bad migration story. Right? And in fact, I've told customers, custom site definitions, stay away. Creates more headaches later on down the line than it's really worth. Right? And you're not really gaining much because a lot of times people do it because they think they can change the site definition there and somehow get it to retroactively go back and apply to all those things. And that may work sometimes and may not work other times. So custom site definitions, though a lot of power, have created a bunch of headaches. So in the SharePoint 2007 world came out, there was feature stapling. And everybody blogged about this. And those of you who are watching this later, this is where the drinking game session happens. Every time I use the word feature, you drink a shot. Because how do you explain feature stapling to somebody? Well, you write a feature that basically attaches a feature to other, based on a particular definition or template as these things get provisioned. Right? So feature of a feature of a feature, and yay. The problem I have with feature stapling is that it is very, very broad. Meaning that once you attach it to a particular definition, it's going to activate those features anywhere you use that. Well, that works really well for like my sites, because you're only ever going to use the my site definition for that purpose. In this scenario, I want to use the STS default team site template, but I only want these changes to be for project sites. I might have other STS team sites that I want a different set of features to be used. And if I go about feature stapling, that's a very big hammer to really try to make it that strategic as to where I apply things or not. Agree? Okay, so people are still nodding, so you're with me? Provisioning providers, if you've never heard of them, doesn't matter, forget them. A little left over from very old versions of the product, not really supported in terms of, it's where you really write a class file that takes over the whole provisioning engine of the product. You should stay away from it. Of course, custom code, which we're doing a little bit, but the idea is to write as little custom code as possible, right? How many of you heard of web templates? That's not a lot. If you're in an organization that's thinking of creating templates, find your developer, beat them up, go read up on web templates. They're new to SharePoint 2010. They're not that different than custom site definitions, but they have a lot of, they don't have as many cons and a lot more pros. A web template is, the reason people don't know it, because they go into Visual Studio, they go File, New, and it's not there. But if you add an empty element, and press the little less than sign and start typing the XML, web template, it's there. And what you're doing with a web template is you're basically building what looks like a site definition, but you're really specifying just the delta between what you want to do and the out-of-the-box definition. Only the delta, right? Which means a lot less headaches. And that's what I'm going to show you in the demo. So this last one is the Uber demo. So let's switch over. This is running on-prem, my SharePoint environment. Since we're going to Disney later tonight, I thought I'd let you all ooh and ah. That's my 3-year-old dressed up in her Belle costume at the Disney store. She says that she is a princess too. Thank you all. See, if nothing else, you enjoyed the session, right? Let's ignore this for a minute. So what I'm going to do is kind of a similar demo here. So I'm going to go in and start with a form. So let's do, for my project title, just test 101. Lovely description here. Can't type. Project number, remember that's what we want the URL to be based on, right? I need a project manager who's going to be the default. I should pick on some of the people in the audience here, but I won't. I'll pick on my coworker, Mr. McDonald. And I'll go ahead and click submit. Now, there are a few things that are going on behind the scenes here that I'm going to hint at. Notice first that that form, when I submitted it, is in a pending status. So on this form library, I've turned on stuff requires approval. Why am I going to do that? Well, it turns out that in this example, this workflow that I'm going to trigger, it's not anything custom, not even a SharePoint designer workflow. All this is a configured out-of-the-box approval workflow. How, you don't believe me? Look, when I trigger this manually, that's the out-of-the-box approval workflow form. Right? So I'm not doing anything custom in the workflow. But I am going to take advantage of the fact that an out-of-the-box workflow can set that little status bit from pending to approved. And once it's approved, then I'm going to have some custom stuff happen. All right. So let's go ahead and click Start. It's in progress. Lovely, complicated workflow. So I'll go ahead and edit it and approve. Voila. Now remember, this is my home page of my intranet, if you will. My project sites that I'm creating are not children of this site collection. There are peers underneath that managed path. How can I prove that to you? Let's go back to Central Administration, or open it up to begin with because I closed it. If I go into Application Management, View All Site Collections, we said there was one called 101, right? So there's that brand new site collection. Let me zoom in so you can see it. And if I look over onto the right, notice it has a URL, exactly what we want. Notice the user didn't get asked for that, right? They couldn't mistype in anything. I took the description, the title of it, and made that the title of the site. I took the description they entered and made that the description of the site. I assigned the administrator, and I chose this content database, Project SP Content DB. They didn't get to choose a template, right? I picked the template because it matches the business process. So let's zoom back out, copy and paste this URL, take a look at the end result. So there's my new site, project site /101. Sure enough, if we go into site settings and go into site collection, the auditing features that are here, all of the auditing's turned on, which is off by default. Again, these are the things I just chose to turn on. If I go back to the home page here, the breadcrumb navigation, which is behind my magnifying glass. So let me zoom in now that I have that up. Move this. This breadcrumb navigation makes it look like Test 101 is underneath the project sites where the user filled out the form. And by the way, I have a little web part here that if I go ahead and put on this page, this is more just for the demo. This really wouldn't be here for users to see. But this web part is showing you some of the settings that this site collection knows about itself. Notice it knows that it used the project web template. That's the name of my web template that I'm going to show you how I created. Right? That's different because if you just create site templates, they think they're based off of the root site definition you use. You can't really tell them apart from the ones you create from the site template itself as opposed to the site definition. It knows what its project number is, and it also knows what its quota is. Interested in seeing how this was built? All right. So we have Visual Studio open here. And again, I didn't mention this earlier. At the end of this, there's a link to my blog. And the source code for this session is already posted there. So you can go and download it. All right. So here I am choosing to run with an elevated identity. So I go and get all the data out of the form. I figure out who David McDonald really is. I'm going to make him listen to this session afterwards. I go in and I find my content database, right? And down here is where all the work really happens. So it says, in that content database, add a site collection with that URL, project name, English language 1023. And over here, this is getting scrolling difficult here. For the template that you pass in, notice it has this really long string with a GUID and a label. This is the name of my web template. Where does the GUID come from? It's the feature that was used to deploy the web template. And I just stick that project number in the root property bag. That's how that web part's pulling it back out. So that this code that is here is an event receiver. It's running when the form gets updated. And notice the very first line checks and see whether or not we're in an approved state. So if the moderation status bit is spmoderation.approved. So that's how my event receiver is not running the very first time the form gets submitted in a pending state. So what does the web template look like? How do you create a web template? I have a lot of links for you at the end because it is not for the not for everybody to get into, but it's not also as complicated as a site definition. All you're doing is defining the delta. So notice here, I have a few features in this project. Let's focus on the web template feature itself. So the web template feature has an elements.xml file that you have to know to type web template to get this stuff applied. So here's where I say the name of the template. These two attributes here say, what am I basing this off of? Remember, this is a delta, so what am I looking at in terms of a root? What's the title going to be? What's the description? Where should it show up in that little category? Now, frankly, for this demo, I should have added a is hidden true, or made it so that it couldn't be seen in that self-service site creation process. Mainly because I don't want my users to be able to use this anywhere else outside of the business form workflow process that I've set up, right? So it should have been hidden, but I like showing off that it's there. And then notice these two properties of portal name and portal URL. Just setting those declaratively gets the breadcrumb navigation to point back. That's the portal connection property a lot of people see in site administration. And I've said that subweb is false. That means it can only be used for root site collections. It should not be shown up in the dialog for when people are creating subsites. Now, there is an onet.xml file, and I told you I like to write these in my sleep and use Notepad and all those things. The good news is, how do you create these? Well, since I'm basing this off of the STS template, I copy the onet.xml file from the one that's the base, and then I delete lots of stuff. I delete more than I write. Always a good thing for a developer, yes? So notice all the things like list templates, document templates, lists, modules, they're all gone. Really, the only thing I care about in this onet.xml file is that I added one feature here, which is going to activate my custom site collection feature stuff, and another one that's going to activate stuff that I want to do at a web level. And it's in these two containers where I have all the different governance switches that I want to turn on and off for these types of sites. I can show you just a few of those if you're curious. So if we look at the site collection level ones, so the site collection level ones include that web part, which is trivial. But there's also a little event receiver here that says when this feature is activated, here's my 3 lines of code to turn on all the auditing functionality. Right? Here's my 1 line of code to make sure that my quota template gets set automatically. Right? So I said it was a little code, but a lot of XML. At the web level, I go in and I set the welcome page. It turns out that you also have to copy the default.aspx page over and provision that yourself into the web template. I set a property bag info, and I also create the shared documents library. So if I go in and scroll down here, the property bag is probably the most interesting one. I'm putting this in, and by the way, this value in this property bag is available from PowerShell as well. So it would give you the ability to run a script or to go through and identify whether or not this team site collection, is one that was created from the root site definition or from my special template. Because just like site templates, the site that I create thinks it's based off of the root definition, not my little delta. But because I'm able to write code like this XML that's here, I can put that little reminder in for myself that I can't do with site templates. So that if I then want to write a script and go out and automate one or the other, selectively those different sets, I can. This also means that migration is going to be a bit easier because as far as the site knows, it's based off of one of the out-of-the-box site definitions. And it's easier to migrate because everything that I've decided to turn on or off in terms of switches is all delivered via features. Right? It's not just some magic snapshot picture that you take when you click Save as Site Template. So those are the big things. Just one last goodie before we kind of move over to Q&A is I kind of bypassed and skipped over this little web part that's here. This is a little navigation control that I created because I get asked a lot, Ed, if I take your strategy and create all these flat site collection structures, how are my users ever going to navigate anything? Right? So what do people do? Developers write code, and it's the worst code they could possibly write. They write code that grabs hold of the web application, enumerates across all the site collections, checks all of the permissions, and then displays the list. And then they call up Microsoft and say, hey, it doesn't scale. The page takes too long to load. Well, as it turns out, there's already something that has enumerated all of your site collections, recorded all the security ACLs, and if you ask, it will return in sub-second time the list of site collections that you have access to. Search. So this web, now obviously, of course, it doesn't update immediately. I have to wait for my index to run. On my local machine, it's turned off, which is why I don't get the 101 that we created. But this web part here that you can definitely steal, it's in the code download. We don't need to save any changes. Just to show you, it's issuing a search request where I'm looking for objects that are not documents, things that have a content class of STS site. STS site is the way the system internally identifies site collections. If, by the way, if you wanted to return all webs that somebody has access to, it's just STS web in that query. And you could do an OR and give them one whole set of both. Right? And notice there's also this little clause where I'm looking to make sure that my URL, I don't want just any site collections, I want one where the URL, the href, contains that managed path of /project sites so that I don't get all of the site collections in the whole topology just targeted to those. That was my Uber demo. Okay. So the key concepts that are there, you don't always have to build a custom workflow. I use the out-of-the-box one in that demo. You just rely on that status bit to flip. From code, you can control what content database is used. I get asked that a lot. Web templates are actually the preferred template mechanism. Don't jump all the way to site definitions because site templates aren't good enough for you. Take the time in your organization to learn about what web templates are. When you deploy that web template, you can deploy them as sandbox solutions, believe it or not, so they will work in Office 365. But in that case, if it's sandbox, it's only able to be used to create webs, subsites. It cannot be used to create root site collections because you need to have a farm-level feature, a farm-level web template for that root site collection topology. And then don't forget that search is your good resource for building cross-site navigation tools. In terms of review, to wrap up here, find some balance. The reason SharePoint is popular is because end users are able to do a lot of stuff themselves. Don't write governance policies and procedures so forth that anytime a user wants to do something, it takes you 3 weeks to get back to them in order to turn all that on. This stuff is automatable, if not through Visual Studio Code like I've done here, through PowerShell. Right? Start building scripts and automating things so that as administrators, you don't have to do every action. Right? Customize to your needs. I showed you a bunch of different examples. InfoPath forms are lovely data gathering mechanisms for these types of things. These are the resources. I mentioned my blog, which is at the top of this list. I've posted the source code already. It's one zip file. You can download it. That is reference code. Do not email me if you run it in production. Right? There are a few references here of other blogs. In particular, the one on creating web templates at the bottom is a great resource. Just so it's on record for the audio, there's one thing that's kind of missing in that blog article, and that is that if you build a web template, you want to make sure that when you press F5 and deploy, that your project configuration for that deployment is set to no activation. Because when you deploy a web template, you really don't want to activate all the features that you just wrote, because you're just deploying the template. When the site gets created, all of those features turn off. So you'll get errors saying libraries are missing and stuff's missing if you don't set no activation on your deployment. And please fill out an eval. Anybody using the Windows phone app to fill out their evals? Oh, sweet, yes. It's funny, somebody pulled up the SharePoint conference portal page for me, and I think it was the first time I'd seen it. I've been doing everything through the phone app, so I'm a big fan. That's it. I got 5 minutes for questions, which was by design. Though if you want to take a question, please line up at the microphone so we can record those for people who watch the session afterwards.
Is it on now? Oh, there we are.
There you go.
If you're using web templates, and you can essentially base that off of any site template that you want to be able to build that around?
Yeah, so even the publishing templates, which of course site templates have that problem, you can even base it off of the publishing templates themselves. So any of the ones that are there out of the box, you can point that as the root.
Right, and then can you add and remove web parts or lists and all that stuff from
Well,
that
so
site
I
template?
even did the list for the shared documents library, right? So you can. Web parts are a bit interesting. If you use the publishing templates, it's very easy to write declarative XML to put web parts in zones, right? It's very hard to do when you're using the wiki style editing, because a lot goes on behind the scenes in terms of injecting that markup into the wiki and the zone storage that's behind the scenes. So if that's part of your template goal of being able to automatically put web parts into certain places, I'd recommend building it off of the publishing template. I have an example of that. Unfortunately, it didn't fit into this scenario, but that's a better tactic. You won't have to write any code to do that. If you go the route of using the wiki editing styles, it ends up being a lot of reading blogs and figuring out what goes on behind the scenes to get the web part to appear, because there's no real special way to denote where it should appear in the wiki itself.
Right. We usually do publishing anyway, so that works fine.
Yes, it'll work beautifully with publishing. I meant to point that out in my talk, and I forgot, so thank you for asking. Yes, sir.
Is it reasonable to build these automated websites across web applications?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, of course, whatever process is running that code always has to have privileges in the destination. But there's no reason why it couldn't be in different web applications. Now, my code will only work if it's in the same farm, because I'm not relying on web services to do these things, right? But you could change the code to even do that as well.
Okay. And just back to the beginning of your presentation. I think Microsoft has a recommendation about 10 web applications per farm. I know you were like wishy-washy. I've been trying to keep the web applications down. What's your
opinion on that? So there's a T-shirt that somebody's handing out down in the exhibit hall that has like a piece of toast that says SharePoint on it and this toaster, and it says "It depends" underneath of it. Yeah, there's one right there. That's the answer to that question.
Okay.
And unfortunately, a lot of it is hardware dependent, because web applications usually you start equating it to app pools. And then with app pools, you're talking about memory and CPU resources, right? Can you have more than one web app sharing an app pool? It's possible, right? But it all comes down to, once you've done that, you're now using a shared memory address space. So how does that fit with customizations and things that you're rolling out? So unfortunately, there's no easy answer to that question. It depends.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay. I think we're good. Thanks a lot, guys.